Okay, we're being recorded, so we can hopefully share the webinar later. So thanks so much for joining. I'm gonna see if I can share my screen. That's not what I want to do. Just a moment.
Okay.
Okay, and you can, Jennifer and Alicia, I can see your faces. Can you nod if you can see this? Okay, thank you. Perfect. So yeah, so thanks everyone for joining. I appreciate all of you participating. I appreciate Aviva and Jeff helping me put together this webinar on some short notice. So the purpose of this webinar is to give a quick overview of 3 national policy initiatives that are in various stages of forming and implementation at this point. And really to spend most of the time on the webinar today, seeing what the goals are and what the goals are that are in common between these 3 initiatives, and then starting to think about how we can align these efforts and work together. So we're going to have 3 short presentations today. I'm going to start by talking about a proposal that NABC has been developing to help coordinate national grassland policy efforts. I still have to admit people here. Okay. And then after that, we're going to hear from Aviva Glazer, who's the Director of Agriculture Policy at the National Wildlife Federation. She's going to talk about NWF's proposal to develop a North American grassland conservation act and what that would entail. Then we're going to hear from Jeff Hodges, who's the grassland coordinator for the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. He's going to talk about a native grassland alliance, which is going to promote the adoption of a native vegetation standard across all USDA programs. So each of the speakers is going to talk for maybe 5 to 7 minutes. Between each speaker, we'll have a few minutes for questions about the presentation. And then I'm hoping we'll have 25 to 30 minutes at the end to really start to identify similarities between these efforts and to think about how we can best align these efforts and where it's appropriate for us to collaborate. Okay. So I don't think we're going to have a really huge group today, but here are our protocols for engagement. Please do stay on mute when you're not speaking. I think some of you are not muted right now. I can mute you one by one, but it's helpful if you mute yourselves. Don't forget to unmute if you have a question. And when people have questions, you can either type questions using the chat feature that should show up for you at the bottom. It'd be nice if other people can talk than just the 3 of us presenting. So you can also type question or comment into the chat feature, and then I can call on you in the order that you have questions. We'll see what works. We're all going to get a lot of experience using Zoom over the next couple of months. Okay. So I'm gonna jump into what NABC has been doing and how we got here. So NABC released a document called the National Bird Conservation Priorities in 2018. And this document creates a common framework within which we can organize and communicate about bird conservation. So the document has 5 priority themes, and then each of these themes has 2 priority actions that the whole bird community voted on that we agree urgently need to happen to accomplish bird conservation goals. And so the National Bird Conservation Priorities presents what's essentially a top 10 list of bird conservation actions that have broad agreement across the whole community. And one of the 2 priority actions under the policy and funding theme has to do with grasslands. And this reads, develop and implement a native grassland policy equivalent to the current no net loss policy for wetlands that would preclude federal agencies from providing public subsidies for practices harmful to native grassland habitats. So NAPSI has developed some recommendations for how we as a community can advance or coordinate some of these efforts to develop a national grassland policy that would satisfy this recommendation. The initial team that we had to develop these recommendations was fairly small. It was mostly NAPSI's Legislative and Policy Subcommittee, which is led by Jennifer Cipoletti from ABC. And we also had a few other grassland bird experts on those calls. I think a lot of people on the webinar today were part of that team. And one comment I wanted to make was we initially used language about no net loss in our conversations, but more recently we've gotten feedback that no net loss is not really an appropriate way of describing what we want, since part of the goal is to protect remaining intact grasslands, and restored grasslands don't necessarily serve the same function as intact original grasslands. So I think Aviva is going to talk about this a little bit more later in her NWF presentation, but I just wanted to mention that the recommendations that I sent you contain the phrase no net loss, but I think we're moving away from that phrasing. So some of the parts of NAPSI's recommendations, we acknowledge that any recommendations are going to have to be really multifaceted. They can include things like expanding existing provisions, such as sod saver, potentially developing recommendations for restoration projects to use native grasses. We talked about expanding existing easement programs like those done through the Fish and Wildlife Service. We talked about considering how policies could be incorporated into the Farm Bill, or whether what we're looking to do would require new legislation. And we talked about developing a sort of NACA for grasslands, so like a North American Wetland Conservation Act that would cover grasslands, although we haven't fully defined what that would mean in the NABC sphere. And we also came up with a series of questions that we would need to address. Things like, how do we define grasslands? That can look really different in the Midwest and in the East, for example. What are the threats to grasslands that we want to address? How do we measure loss when we're talking about no loss, or no, when we're talking about no loss? Who should be involved in this effort, and then what mechanisms can be used to accomplish this? Again, are we looking at the Farm Bill, or are we looking at different policies, and what would that look like? So one of the first steps that the team acknowledged is that, you know, before we do much of anything, we really need to build a broad and inclusive team to be thinking about this. That grassland policy arena is very wide. A lot of different groups and organizations and partnerships in the bird conservation community and outside of it have been looking at different elements of grassland policy. So we need to make sure that we have representation, not just from the different grassland policy efforts across the country, but also from other sectors that have a stake in this. So for example, we need to include agricultural economists as one group on this team. And we identified some specific opportunities for advancing these conversations. Hopefully we're still having a trilateral this June, although that's looking less and less likely, but the Trilateral Committee for Wildlife and Ecosystems is an opportunity for the governments of the US, Canada, and Mexico to come together and discuss issues, and grasslands has been a key issue discussed at the Trilateral for the last several years. This summer, we're also having 2 major grassland roadmap summits, a Central Grassland Roadmap Summit in August and a Mississippi Flyway Grassland Summit in September, that are bringing together leaders, biologists, individuals from different sectors like industry and agriculture to really develop roadmaps for where do we go with grasslands for the next 10 years. And then if NABC is going to take a leadership role in really developing this policy, we're going to need to figure out who's going to lead the efforts. So NABC is really at the early stage of fleshing out what our role is related to grassland policy, trying to figure out how we can help these existing efforts come together and coordinate them. We're really excited to think about how we can align with and coordinate with what's already happening in the grassland community. So certainly what NABC has thought about has included an element around implementing policy related to native grasses and planting native grasses, which is something that Jeff Hodges will talk about. We had also envisioned a sort of NACA for grasslands, which I think probably will align really well with what the National Wildlife Federation is doing. So that's what I wanted to say about NABC, really early phases of our efforts. We can take a few questions before Aviva talks about what NWF is doing. Does anyone have any questions about what NABC is trying to do or how NABC sees its role in grassland policy? No questions. Not if you're still there.
Still here.
Excellent.
Well, I was just going to say, I appreciate you convening the discussion, and you know, I think you've outlined a lot of good stuff, and so I think it's really a question of just how do we get in alignment and determine, you know, leadership for some of this moving forward. I'm most interested in the outcomes. So when I go lobby, I have the package that I want. So I'm really interested in the experts kind of identifying.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate that feedback.
Hey, this is Arvin. I'll just chime in and let you know I'm here on the phone. I thought that was a nice summary of our meetings and sort of where we came to, and I think we're still at a pretty early stage there to provide what Steve is looking for, but I definitely like this coming together of various groups because there's a lot more strength in working together on this. And I think from an NABC perspective, we just want to, you know, make sure that the bird conservation needs are addressed in any grassland legislation.
Great, thanks, Arvin. We have something in the chat as well. Oh, someone is trying to get on and can't. I'm not sure what to do about that. Anyway, sorry, I got a message saying someone's trying to get on, but I don't see anyone asking to get in. Okay. Well, so that was a quick overview of NABC, which I hope will sort of set up the other two presentations pretty well. So our next speaker is Aviva Glazer, who's going to talk about the National Wildlife Federation's big and pretty exciting grassland initiative that I think probably overlaps a lot with what we've been trying to do in the bird conservation community. So Aviva, if you want to share your screen, perfect.
Is that working?
Yes, and we can hear you.
Great. Okay, awesome. Well, thanks guys. I'm super excited to be here and talking to you guys about this. I'm also really excited about the opportunity to bring a lot of these ideas and initiatives together around one common theme or purpose. I think that there's a lot of alignment here. And so I'm excited to talk to you about this and to get feedback on this idea. So National Wildlife Federation is proposing a new national grasslands policy. I mean, I think you guys all know how we've been losing millions of acres of grasslands over the last decade, losing native grasslands at an alarming rate. I think you also know that the annual loss of grasslands that we're able to protect is not keeping up with the loss of grasslands. You know, it's great the protections that we do have, the Farm Bill incentives are fantastic, but it's not enough. It's, you know, not nearly enough to keep up with the amount that we need to be conserving. You also know, you know, more than anyone about grassland birds disappearing and, you know, grassland birds in crisis. So I don't need to go into that. But basically, you know, with grasslands in crisis and grassland birds being lost, we think that now is the time for a bold new national policy on grasslands. What we are envisioning is the North American Grasslands Conservation Act, which would be modeled after the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. We think that this kind of bill could help to raise the profile of grasslands and kickstart the protection and restoration of North America's grasslands. We are currently in the process of outlining what that could look like, and I'll talk you through what our current thinking is. But want to be clear that, you know, these are still the initial phases of this. Nothing's locked in yet. So if I say something that makes you nervous or you think, you know, isn't the right thing, you know, let me know. We're at the point where we want to get that feedback now. So our proposed outline of the North American Grasslands Conservation Act, and apologies to those of you who have already heard this, but basically there'd be a number of components to this. Obviously there would be a significant amount of funding attached to it. We have put out a number. It's probably much higher than what we could ever actually get, but you know, it's always important to start high. There would also be a significant planning component, a North American Grasslands Conservation Plan. And you know, that could, I think, identify a lot of the questions about baseline numbers that Judith put out in the beginning, about where we are now, where we need to go, as well as the areas that are most in need of conservation, and having some specific goals around grassland birds and other wildlife. There would also be a trinational component of encouraging our government to develop a trinational agreement on grasslands with Canada, Mexico, and the US. I don't think we could do anything more binding than encouraging that, but I know that some of you guys do a lot of trinational work, so I'd love your input on that component. The heart of this, I think, would be a grant component that could give funding to landowners, agencies, partner NGOs, tribes, to do easement, restoration, management projects that would benefit grasslands and grassland-dependent wildlife. There would have to be some sort of match requirement. Projects would be identified in that grassland conservation plan. That would be the other component of this that I talked about. Potentially some funding for trinational grasslands conservation as well. We are thinking that this would be administered by Fish and Wildlife and not USDA. I'm sure folks have thoughts on that. Yeah, I can talk more later about why we are thinking that, but you know, again, nothing's set in stone right now. But our hope is that this would not just be folded into the Farm Bill and just another Farm Bill program, which is why we'd want it separate from USDA. That's, you know, part of our thinking. There would also be a council created that would recommend and approve projects to receive grants, similar to how NACA works. Potentially, there could be regional councils as well. There would also be a significant monitoring component, directing agencies to create a comprehensive monitoring and mapping program to track conversion and identify areas that are most needed for restoration. And then as well, there'd be an education and outreach component for land grants, extensions, and partners to develop better tools and outreach around grazing management. So that's the proposed outline. We talked a little bit in the beginning about the no net loss goal. Our thinking is that we want this bill to do what no net loss of wetlands did for wetlands. We want to, you know, raise the profile of grasslands like the no net loss policy did for wetlands. We want to jumpstart federal work on grasslands, federal policy work on grasslands like wetlands did. And we like the idea of attaching a grassland goal to the bill. However, we don't think that the no net loss policy works for grasslands. It sounds like you guys have already maybe come to a similar conclusion. You know, part of our thinking is that no net loss was done in the context of a regulatory system. We don't want to regulate grasslands like we do wetlands. We'd never be able to get anything passed if we try to do that. Also, once a native grassland has been converted, you know, the quality of that grassland can never fully be restored. And what we really want, you know, as was said in the beginning, is that we want to get as close to halting conversion of native grasslands as possible. We also don't want to just see no net loss. We want to see, you know, a halting of conversion of native grasslands, but we also want to see an increase in grasslands. We want to see more restoration of grasslands in areas that had been converted, you know, especially those marginal croplands that probably should have never been converted. And we want to see higher quality, better managed grasslands on the acres that we currently have. And then finally, there's been a lot of problems with the no net loss policy for wetlands. One of the major ones being that mitigation often doesn't fully restore wetland functions and values. So, you know, while the overall net losses of wetland acres have slowed, the net loss of wetland functions has been enormous. So we wouldn't want to see something similar happen for grasslands. In terms of our next steps, currently we're doing outreach to stakeholders like you guys. We're gathering input, we're refining this concept. Like I said, nothing's set in stone yet. But once we have it further refined, we'd like to start getting buy-in and organizational support for the concept. And then we'll bring it to congressional champions and try to get something introduced. We know that this is going to be a long process. We don't have any, we don't think that it's going to get passed anytime immediately, but we think that this is a worthwhile big goal that we hope people can all be gathering around and working towards. And we think it's worthwhile to start working on it now. So with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you, Aviva. And so far we have one question in the chat. So what branch, office, or program within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would administer the grant program?
I don't know yet. Do you have any ideas?
Whisper.
Do you want to talk more about that?
Well, I think Migratory Bird Management has a habitat unit.
Yeah, this is Mark Humbert from AFLI. Just, if you look at the volume of funds that the Wildlife Sportfish Restoration Program already administers, there's probably some efficiencies to be gained by using that entity. It probably isn't the only entity, but in terms of moving dollars to other entities, they have great and wide experience in doing that. It wouldn't mean that you couldn't have experts from other, parts of the Fish and Wildlife Service that could help make grant determinations, but there's probably some, at least to examine, the possibility of wildlife sportfish restoration managing program might be useful.
Okay, that's helpful. We do want to start talking to some friends at Fish and Wildlife Service and get their thoughts as well.
Other questions for Aviva?
Yeah, hi, Aviva. This is Arvin. So do you envision a role for USDA in this, or given how much they are impacting grasslands? Maybe I missed that.
Yeah, we have envisioned the role for USDA so far as being on part of the Grassland Council that be created, helping to create the Grassland Conservation Plan, helping to, being part of the mapping and monitoring. But like I said, we are right now saying, thinking that we wouldn't want them to be the agency that administers the grant portion, because we don't want it to be a farm bill, the farm bill program. But if you have thoughts on other roles that the agency could play, we'd be interested.
Yeah, I'm wondering more from the standpoint of, compliance with, or is there, you said there wouldn't be necessarily any regulatory aspect to this? It's strictly an incentive?
We're thinking strictly incentive. Yeah.
Okay.
We have another question in the chat from EJ Williams. Relative to monitoring, excellent inclusion. Is this habitat monitoring, species monitoring, or both?
I think we were thinking habitat. I'm trying to get back to my notes. We were thinking habitat monitoring. I don't know that we thought that there would be, I don't know, do you think that the agencies are able to do the kind of species monitoring that we'd want to see?
EJ, you're welcome to take a stab at that, or anyone else.
I was going to just chime in and say, I think through the network of partners out there, there is models already in place to do the monitoring beyond just the habitat, and would strongly recommend tying birds and acres together, and even pollinators.
You're thinking maybe a component of working with partners to do the species monitoring?
Yes, because at the end of the day, we need to know we're doing the right things in the right places, not only from a grassland restoration and enhancement effort, but from a bird and pollinator perspective as well.
Great. I like that idea.
The other thing I was going to mention is I think we need to think intentionally about the USDA, because whatever recommendations on restoration, enhancement, and native plants, if they're part of that conversation, they could build that into the Farm Bill so it's more complementary and seamless.
Yeah, so another thing I've been thinking about is, I didn't put this in here, was, you know, whether we could have a report that comes out of all the monitoring and the planning, whether there could be a report that comes out the year before every Farm Bill to, you know, help tie into Farm Bill dollars.
The other thing I was just, you know, you're on the summit planning team. There's lots of plans out there, and just trying to think of how the plan you're talking about, the plans that exist, and the roadmaps from the summit can coalesce and complement and streamline.
Yep.
Versus sometimes we end up adding more noise. I don't mean that in the night, but you know what I mean.
Yep.
I'm gonna do one more question from the chat, and then I think we should move on to Jeff's presentation, because some of these I suspect will be applicable to both. So another question from Mark Humpert from AFWA: how would state wildlife action plans that already identify grassland priorities for at-risk species be used to drive grassland priorities for a new program?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think, you know, like Tammy was just saying, there needs to be part of the planning is including other plans and drawing on existing plans, including state wildlife action plans. I think that definitely needs to be a component of this. So I will make that more explicit in our next version of it. That's helpful.
Well, thank you very much, Aviva, and we can continue some of these discussions at the end of the call after we've heard our third presentation. So Jeff Hodges is going to talk about the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative's efforts. Jeff, do you want to go ahead and share your screen?
Yeah, I'll do that here in just a second. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
And like Aviva, I really am excited about the opportunity for this larger group of people to work together on this. I feel like we have an opportunity to really build some momentum here and move forward with some things that are going on. Some of you are probably familiar with the work NBCI did with Natives First, and a lot of help from a lot of other people to get language in the manager's report, conference report of the Farm Bill. So having followed up on that, we're moving on kind of into another phase of that to really focus on trying to create some sort of focus on native vegetation and try to take advantage of the language that's been written into the conference report. And we're kind of moving into what I'd call maybe a marketing or public relations phase. So in October, we had a meeting with a variety of stakeholders, and you can see there all the different groups that were represented in the meeting to get feedback from people on and how we might move this forward. Part of what we did to promote Natives First is we organized a Natives First Coalition. And so this is kind of an extension of that coalition to try to continually move this needle forward on more native vegetation on the landscape. We're primarily targeted to Farm Bill, but really as we move forward here, we're expanding that to include about anybody and everybody where we have an opportunity to get native vegetation on the landscape. So the point of this slide is we had a really broad background of stakeholders there. We had a lot of different representations. So through 2 days of meetings, we were able to come up with some ideas and some recommendations to move forward. So the way I try to explain what the Natives Grasslands Alliance is, and by the way, at that meeting, it was decided that Natives First Coalition was not an appropriate name to use. So At a later time, we came up with Native Grasslands Alliance. But so the way I try to explain this, if you imagine you've all been to a conference where there's, 500, 800, 1,000 people in a room, and all these discussions are taking place. Every single discussion is a really good discussion, but unless you're keyed in on one or two people, all you hear is this roar that's out there. You really don't hear any particular discussion or message. So the idea behind the Natives Grassland Alliance is to create a unified voice promoting native grasslands vegetation. It's to get this 1,000 voices in a room all speaking in unison, but not only unified voice, but also an amplified voice, so that we can create more awareness around the importance of native vegetation, native grasslands. So kind of operating under this idea that all of these individual groups and activities that are going on are kind of under this umbrella that we can use to speak in a unified and amplified voice. So it's a lot more complex than just trying to promote native vegetation. There's areas that we need to look into, that we need to address. So we came up with these 4 cornerstones of strategy, and actually these are different working groups that we thought could work on these different arenas. Of course, with the ultimate goal of advancing the adoption of native vegetation out on the landscape. So we have a policy working group, a research, technical education, awareness. I'll quickly go through each one of those. Policy, pretty straightforward statements from lawmakers to native vegetation-friendly policies. We were talking about a few minutes ago about the role of USDA in the Grasslands Conservation Act. And one of the problems we've run into, we're not using the term no net loss, but for this discussion, how do we know if we've lost grasslands if we don't even know how many grasslands we have? Or we don't know, how do we know we're making any advances? How are we gaining if we don't know what's going on? Through USDA, through their EQIP program, there's native vegetation being planted, but there's also a lot of introduced vegetation being planted. So we asked USDA and RCS to come up with those numbers, and they don't have it. They don't track that information. They can tell you that if something was planted to conservation cover, but they can't really tell you whether it was native or non-native. They just tell you it was conservation cover. So right now, we don't even know how much money USDA is spending on subsidizing the planting of non-native vegetation, let alone what they're spending on planting native vegetation. So that, I think, would be a policy goal that we might want to work towards. Again, an example of what might happen within the policy working group. The research working group, I think we've got some gaps in knowledge out there about native vegetation. If we want to promote native vegetation, native grasslands, we've got to put a value to it, at least in my opinion. We can fairly easily put a value to a wetland or a forest land, but we're not able to put a value on a grassland, an economic value. So that kind of thing needs to be pulled together. And then also this comparison between native versus non-native. We've seen a lot of, to the uneducated, golf course is a grassland, or a fescue pasture is a grassland. And so we need to somehow address the difference between a native and a non-native grassland and the value of that. Technical education is really targeted towards those people who provide frontline advice to landowners. So, we need to work on that, because we get a lot of feedback that we've got a lot of those people that are actually working against us. When they go into that local office or the local and talk to them about planting native vegetation, they're steered away from it just simply through lack of knowledge and familiarity with other things. So we think there's a component that requires this technical education to go to those advisors. And then finally, this awareness, and this is a general concept or a general category, more or less targeted to the general public, landowners to a certain degree. But in this regard, what we're thinking here is as we can create more awareness and assign that value to native grasslands, that becomes part of the discussion right along with the value of pollinators and the value of wetlands and the value of forest land, that we can then illustrate that there is a value to these native grasslands, and that through this combination of activities create this overall awareness that we can that generates the demand for native grasslands, and it makes the policy work in DC easier. It makes the policy work within the states easier, because you got people talking about it, people aware of it. So a little bit about the organization. I don't know how many are familiar with the American Wildlife Conservation Partners, but that would kind of be a model that we would follow. It's individual member organizations. They still maintain all their primary interests, but they would work collectively to expand awareness and acceptance. So what it does, the Native Grasslands Alliance creates this unified, but also add that amplified voice. The idea is to share resources between each of the individual groups that are part of that, to have these working groups attacking or addressing these individual areas that we're talking about, and then overall have some improved effectiveness in promoting native grasslands and native grassland vegetation and all different types of applications. Membership be open to any group. The only thing we're going to ask is that they agree to help us promote native grasslands vegetation. So right now, the status of this, we're as they're in the very early stages, and also Judith, early stages of trying to figure out what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. So we're maybe just a touch past that. We're still in the early stages of defining our role, and I think it will evolve as we start to work into it. But right now, we're working on developing this communications plan. We plan to do a soft launch to our Natives First Coalition members here in the very near future. We're getting close on having our website and our social media ready to launch. But the idea we're working around is doing a hard launch on National Prairie Day on June 6th of this year, where we'll go widespread public, do as much public relations, PR, press release type stuff we can do. And we'll also be requesting our partner participation at that time to help us more or less launch the Native Grasslands Alliance. So that's it in a nutshell.
Great, thank you so much, Jeff. What questions do people have for Jeff? Well, I have one, and maybe you said this and I missed it, but how is the Alliance defining native? Is it native to the country or to a region or to a state?
We're leaving that up to the individual organization that joins. We don't necessarily want to get into that discussion. We're trying to be as broad and as inclusive as we can. We're promoting the overall message that we want native vegetation on the landscape. I know there's potentially a room for a lot of argument there, but we're just trying to keep it as broad as possible and let each individual organization do its own definition of what they decide is native. And I'm assuming you're talking about like regional adaptations, that type of stuff. I mean, otherwise we're talking about, native as in endemic to the area, where region that would be.
Other questions or thoughts for Jeff?
And I would add, this is, although not specifically targeted to working lands, it's probably a little more focused on working lands. Um, and because we're in BCI, it's more eastern part of the United States is what we're thinking. We've got a lot of introduced grasslands that we'd like to see converted to native grasslands for managed grazing and proper kind of management, so that we get the bird habitat that we're looking for, the pollinator habitat that we're interested in.
Great. We have two things in our chat box. One comment from Jane Fitzgerald. I just want to mention how much this effort is needed in the central and eastern U.S., where native grasslands were lost over 100 years ago. And then Jen Mock-Schaefer asks, the AWCP has a charter and bylaws to govern activities, processes, and membership. Has that been developed yet?
It has not. That is probably a step or two down the line. Again, we're really early into this process. We're interested in starting to get groups informed and interested in what we're doing. What I'd really like to do at some point in the near future is put together a small committee or a working group to actually go through and develop the bylaws and organization, the very formal aspect of that.
We have another question from Arvind. Hi, Jeff. Is the scope of the alliance U.S. only, or does it include Canada and Mexico?
At this point, it's U.S., but I could certainly see, particularly if trying to align with the other efforts that are going on with the Grasslands Conservation Act, and that does become trilateral, that we could certainly expand it. But at this time, it's strictly American.
Any other questions for Jeff?
I was just gonna ask Jess, I'm assuming with Jane on the call too, this to make sure that there's voices at the summits that are coming up that would represent the Native Grasslands Alliance. I see South Dakota's on there and they're invited to the summit. Anyways, just want to make sure the different voices together.
I know I will be at the Mississippi summit. I'd be happy to go to South Dakota. I don't know of anybody else that would be there.
Okay, let's follow up after, Jeff, just to figure out if we already have a couple people who's involved in this from South Dakota, or
Okay.
you should come too. Thanks.
Well, we have about 15 more minutes left on this call, and I wanted to broaden the conversation now and really talk about the opportunities for aligning these efforts and what the next steps are for moving forward with the collaboration. So I have some thought questions. So I had come up with three thought questions that we can look at one at a time, or whatever you want to dive into. But some of the things that we might want to consider are, what are the specific elements of these initiatives that offer opportunities to collaborate? Are you seeing those areas of alignment? What elements of a successful national grassland policy are missing from these initiatives, if any? Extra places that NABC might want to look to coordinate. And then what are the next steps for aligning these efforts? So does anyone want to make any comments on the first question? Are you seeing things that we should dive into as a community, those areas of alignment? I've lost my chat box.
Judith, I'll jump in for a minute here, and at the risk of sounding a little bit selfish, I think the opportunities working on the policy, the conservation, Grasslands Conservation Act and whatnot, it would fit well within the policy working group that the Native Grasslands Alliance has set up. And then the other role that I see is with the Native Grasslands Alliance developing and creating a number of I'm thinking a large number of members represented by the organizations that join. We could create a fairly large army of foot soldiers and communicate with them very easily through the alliance, and use that as maybe use the alliance as a communications tool to get messages out and to garner support. But from that policy working group, just having the people involved in the discussions through the Conservation Act could be a role that we could see happening within the Native Grasslands Alliance.
Thanks, Jeff. Other thoughts? And by the way, I think I can't share my screen and also see the chat at the same time. So if you're chatting, I might be missing it.
Well, this is Steve at American Bird Conservancy. We're interested in identifying all the pieces that would be helpful moving forward. And, of course, I've looked at the legislation, and I think that it looks really good. And, then, of course, we have a farm bill that'll be coming up at some point in a few years. And there's also the possibility that a year from now, we could be looking at a different administration with a little higher focus on conservation. And so I think that we're going to want to have some ideas ready for them. I'm also hearing about the possibility of a jobs package where shovel-ready projects might see a huge amount of funding that wasn't previously available. So I think for all of these opportunities, it makes sense to in a sense have a plan. And so I like the legislation. I think that's something that's just ready to go. We could start working on that. But obviously, I'm interested in identifying all the pieces, including possible regulatory components or reforms that could be done through the next farm bill.
Thanks, Steve. And I found my chat. I think NABC can and should align with the groups already working on North American Grassland Conservation Act. Our thoughts for the direction of this policy initiative should work in collaboration with other groups rather than starting from the beginning. And I think that was Jennifer Cipoletti, and I agree.
Yeah, I was gonna say I agree with that too. And just how do we, where possible, bring the different efforts together so that we get, again, the idea of less noise, common messaging, unified voices, all headed in the same direction. And both efforts are great. All three are great, of course. But when I listen to the Bob White Initiative, the Native Grasslands Alliance, it's I think of it in tiers. Like we want to save our grasslands, and then getting into the details of what that looks like. And at the end of the day, we may not all agree on natives, which ones are most important, but are there almost tiers of highest, best, greatest that's going to have native grasslands benefiting birds, rangeland health, pollinators. Sometimes you have to start at some common base of grass, and then how can we incentivize and get to the highest quality where possible? If any of that made sense.
It did, to me. Aviva, did you want to respond at all to where you see opportunities to collaborate now that you've heard all the presentations and more about the NBCI efforts and partners?
Yeah, definitely. We're really excited about the idea of working with you guys on this North American Grassland Conservation Act. I also really like Steve's points about the other opportunities that are out there, you know, including Farm Bill. You know, one thing that's not included in the North American Grasslands Conservation Act is National Sod Saver, but, you know, we think that that is obviously critically important, and, you know, would love to work with you guys on creating more of an effort around getting National Sod Saver, which is something we need to start doing, you know, way before the next Farm Bill. And also completely agree about the need to start thinking about the next administration and opportunities that we can, recommendations we can present to them around grasslands, which can be a lot of the same ideas and different ideas. So I think that those were really great points that I'd be excited about working with you guys on.
Thanks, Aviva. And we
One
have
of the things, oops, Judith, I just wanted to add, one of them is we were recently on a call with General Mills, and the joint ventures across the country were part of that. And the idea that, you know, at the end of the day, there will be land that's going to continue cultivated, and they also will support pollinators and grassland birds to some extent. And how do we help make those practices more sustainable and include native pollinators where possible, cover crops? I'm just trying to make sure we're not just excluding partners on the landscape that are obviously influencing what's going on the ground, and how do we come together to kind of have that shared responsibility of healthy systems. And then also with the National Wildlife Federation effort, I would encourage you to include industry, because, you know, different industries, oil and gas, coal, they own land, they do go back and do restoration, and ideally we're in helping them restore it in the best way possible, or influencing where they're putting implements on the ground and minimizing the footprint. Just want to keep that in mind. You know, we were part of an effort with ABC, with Pepsi, and at the end of the day, those companies are influencing ag lands and potato fields and different things. And how do we help them know what areas they should try to minimize and not develop? So just another thing to think about.
And we have a comment from EJ saying, this summer federal agencies will likely start working on transition plans in preparation for the November election. I think it would be great to have something on National Grasslands Conservation for inclusion in each agency's transition plan, Fish and Wildlife Service, NRCS, FSA, etc. Well, we have 5 minutes left, and I would like to skip to the final question. I want to make sure that we have at least a next step, so we see a path forward for us to better work together. So does anyone have any thoughts on marching orders? How can we make sure that this collaboration gets off the ground? Can anyone propose a couple of next steps in the immediate future for us to better align these efforts?
This is Arvind. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I saw Aviva had circulated a draft of the North American Grasslands Conservation Act, and I think it's helpful to have something like that. I don't know if you're ready to share that more widely, but that can start literally help get us all on the same page.
Thanks, Arvind. I've already gotten, I want to take a look at the feedback I've gotten from you guys today. I've also gotten some feedback from other groups we've been talking about, so I will be incorporating that into our draft proposal. And once I have that incorporated, I would love to send it to you guys so you have something a little bit more concrete to respond to.
I was just going to suggest that after Aviva, you have a chance to go through that and send it out to all of us. Maybe we want to reconvene with the folks that are working on this with each of the organizations and maybe review the document and see how we can, you know, either strengthen it or if it is aligning with everything that we feel is all encompassing with what's needed for this grasslands policy initiative.
Sounds great.
Hi, this is Amy Robertson. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Amy.
Hi. This is really great. I'm so excited to see so many groups and people coming together around grassland policy. And I was trying to comment earlier and accidentally hung up, so I missed some of the beginning of the conversation, and I hope I'm not repeating something, but it seems like, you know, NIFWIF is focused on this NAGCA idea, which is an incentive-based program, probably funneled through the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Native Grasslands Alliance is focused on something very specific as well, also a very worthy cause. And I think in the NABC conversations I've been a part of, we've talked about really needing kind of a portfolio of policy options. And so it sounds like the other two groups we've been talking about today are working on some pretty specific things. So maybe the NABC group, if we all have another meeting in the near future, maybe the timing is right when Aviva has a next draft to share, but maybe then the NABC group could think about, you know, filling in the gaps of what's not covered by these two other initiatives, and then looking at, you know, whether they're Farm Bill specific, you know, what are the things that we can add that also need to happen, but maybe don't fit necessarily in the other two initiatives or bills. So if we stay as a NABC group working on those things, meet periodically with the larger group to refine our vision and make sure we're having that unified voice, it seems like we could really build a strong effort collectively with sort of these subgroups working on different important components of kind of a portfolio.
Thanks, Amy. I love that idea, and I too would like to see us evaluate those gaps and then fill in where necessary. And I think too, both Aviva and Jeff, I mean, you've both laid out some next steps in your presentation, but I think it would be helpful if you have a specific ask that the broader bird community can help with. You know, maybe lay that out, and we can circulate that among this group and among NABC partners so that we can really have some concrete ideas for what you need to support these efforts.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Well, it is noon here on the East Coast. We have one more comment. It seems like one of NABC's roles would be to make sure the policies align with bird conservation specifically. Yep, good point. That's Jane Fitzgerald. Okay, so for next steps, we had things like Aviva will circulate the NAGCA draft when that's ready for more feedback. We talked about reconvening to review that document, doing sort of a gap analysis of the existing efforts to see what NABC's role might be, and then maybe having Jeff and Aviva circulate some specific needs that they see for these initiatives. We recorded this webinar. I'll make it available so that we can share it with people that were not on here. I may convert it into notes just to sort of hone in on some of these ideas. Yeah, and thank you so much. This I think was really good. I'm excited that we're getting these things off the ground and that we're aligning a lot of these big picture efforts that have been happening for a little while or for a long time. So thank you. I appreciate all your time today, and I'm sure we'll be in touch soon. That's all.
Great, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Talk soon.
Thank you.
All right, bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.